Facebook is one of the most sought after companies to work for, and not only internationally, but also as compared to other companies in Silicon Valley. And probably the most compelling reason why so many people want to work there is because you get the opportunity to work on a website that gets visited by a good chunk of the world's population every day. So while they do make it sound very easy to apply for a job at Facebook, there are, however, some highlights that I'll try to talk about into detail throughout this video, particularly for the cultural part. So without further ado, let's just jump straight into it. Looking at the company's core values and mission is probably the most important thing you could do while preparing for a job interview. And at Facebook, for instance, Sheryl Sandberg starts every meeting by re-emphasizing Facebook mission, that is, to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. And just as a quick note, this is the newer version of their mission, and the older one being to give people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. Now, you've probably noticed the emphasis on community on their latest mission. Now, this being said, it's very important to note from the beginning that Facebook is no longer buying into that rather old-fashioned concept of hiring specifically for culture fit. And here is an official statement from Facebook's spokesperson. At Facebook, we've explicitly asked interviewers not to use the term culture fit when giving feedback on a candidate because that phrase can easily allow bias to influence the outcome of an interview. As part of a larger effort to help people identify and correct for the biases that we all inherently have, interviewers at Facebook go through managing bias training and are encouraged to use the skills they've learned when interviewing candidates. So this being said, Facebook's 5 core values are something that are at the core at its recruitment strategy. So probably the best way to explain this first core value would be to talk a bit about Facebook's founder story. That is, this is not his first project. He was actually involved in many other ones, including other social networking websites. And as he once said, if he knew what would it mean to build a company like Facebook, he would have never started in the first place. Now, another example he gave at the Harvard commencement speech was during the early days of Facebook, when the company started growing, and other major companies were increasingly interested in buying Facebook, but Mark Zuckerberg wasn't interested in selling. He was rather interested in this incredible opportunity to connect more people. So again, an example of taking a bold bet. So maybe for you as a candidate, a good idea would be to prepare a story, a similar highlight in your life from which it would reflect this mentality of taking bold bets. Focusing on impact is another important core value at Facebook, and in another speech that Mark Zuckerberg gave at Harvard, he referenced the unique opportunity that our generation has to take on the world's greatest problems, and this is of course due to the recent technological advances creating this sort of opportunity. But more interestingly, I believe for a candidate, the main takeaway here is that you should be the type of person that gets motivated by this sense of a higher purpose. So I believe this is a great test to see whether you'd be a great fit inside Facebook. So moving fast is probably best explained by Sheryl Sandberg in an interview, I believe a decade ago or so, in which she explained the major difference between Google's culture and Facebook's culture. And at Google, they are more about AI and about a more structured approach. And whenever they launch something, they do so in stages, in and by contrast, at Facebook, everything is moving much faster. Everything is around iterating as fast as possible and basically shipping a product and see how it works. So this is, I believe, also a very unique element for Facebook's workplace. So being open and building social value in general is also best explained by one of Mark Zuckerberg's speeches, in which he said that their initial goal with Facebook was not to become a company. So I guess the main takeaway here is you shouldn't start a company for the sake of finding problems that you should solve, but you should go the other way around. But anyway, within a recruitment context, I believe your main thing to understand here is that you should be the type of person that again gets turned on by this sense of a higher purpose that I earlier referenced. And notice again the use of the word social and community. So you should also make the connection with their new mission at Facebook. So unlike many other technical companies, Facebook's recruiters are quite transparent when it comes to Facebook's interviewing process, which basically consists of submission of your CV, then followed by a discussion, and then an on-site interview. But before getting into that, let me just show you how Facebook sees seniority into a very interesting table that I found online. Now, seniority aside, Facebook also has a particular interesting hiring procedure in the sense that they have two types of tracks, hiring tracks. First one is that of individual contributors, that is focused on your technical abilities more than anything else. And the second one is for more management-oriented roles. So for the second one, the people skills being the main highlight of the overall interview. Now, also to be noted here is that if you happen to go for a management track, but you do particularly well for a technical one, you might be offered a role, but it would likely be within another team. And just as a final note here, Facebook usually hires in a general way, and then there's something that they call a boot camp, during which you will essentially find out what's the best team for you to fit in. Now, for the specificities of a Facebook hiring process, probably the best way would be to quote a recruiter's post on Quora. The interview process isn't exactly the same for every role or team, but in general it follows somewhat of a pattern. There are also differences for technical and non-technical roles, but in this example I focus exclusively on technical. First, you'll talk to a recruiter like me. Our goal is to primarily inform and educate people about Facebook and guide them through the interviewing process. We'll also get a sense of your background and if it makes a good fit for the teams we recruit for. In some cases, a recruiter might also introduce you to another recruiter who hires for a team that is a better fit. Second, in many cases you'll do 1 to technical phone screens as the next step. Depending on your area of expertise, team and level of experience, this could be everything from coding to Linux troubleshooting. If you're in management, you might do a combination of management tech interviews before as your phone screens. Third, you'll come on site. During your on-site, I'd expect somewhere between 4 and 6 interviews on average. Most of these will be technical and specific to the org or team you're interviewing for. Nearly all on-site interviews will include some variation of code and system designs, plus a soft skills or team fit interview. Ahmad explains this pretty well below. Fourth, then we'll review and make a decision, offer or no offer. Now, when it comes to some details and advice on what to expect at each stage, here is another great post on the same thread. For software engineers, here's the process. 1 to phone interviews, 2-3 whiteboard coding interview, 1-2 design, and 1 cultural fit interview. Based upon your past work experiences, you can have more design interview and less coding interviews. Now about the details about each of these interviews. First is a coding interview, solving a coding question on whiteboard. This has become a prerequisite for getting an offer. If you cannot code or solve the problem or have some serious bugs in your code, it's quite difficult to get an offer. Good resources to prepare of this kind of interview, it's Code Rust and Lead Code. You should expect at least 2 coding interviews in a loop. Second, the system design interview. This tests your design skills and your ability to work with complex and scalable services. Your performance on these interviews determines what position and salary you will be offered. If you have commendable design skills, you will get a higher offer. A good resource to prepare for this interview is Grokking the system design interview. And third, the cultural fit interview. During this interview, companies see if a candidate would be a good fit for their culture. Candidates should not show any red flag. A few sample questions are: how good programmer, developer, student were you in the past? Your resume, work history, side, open source projects, educational project, all play a major role here. What kind of coworker you would be? The interviewer will try to evaluate if they would like to work with you in a team. Your motivation, empathy, and perseverance will be assessed. Do you have any red flag in your personality? How did you handle conflict in the past? How do you handle a difficult coworker, etc.? Do you strive for success and growth? Remember that you are applying at one of the top companies in the world. They would like to hire above average people. How do they assess these things? Well, it's quite simple. It's by asking you questions, behavioral questions. For instance, how do you handle a difficult coworker, or to ask you to talk about your greatest successes. And the main thing that you should realize here, that you interview with one of the best companies in the world. So even if the highlight of your job is not to be an amazing communicator, you should be at least a great communicator in this case. Now, how do you go about that? Well, I believe the best way to prepare for the behavioral part of the interview would be to work on preparing your own stories. I believe around 5 stories. And for example, one story should be about your greatest success in your career, or one story could be about a time when you dealt with a major failure. So the approach that I'm proposing here would be to take your time and write down all the possible details about one story, for instance. And even if it takes 1 hour, that's not greatly exaggerating it. And the main reason is here to try to remember as much as information as possible with respect to that particular event. Now, then after you have all the details in place, and preferably in a narrative format, try to synthesize that information into essentially 4 sections. The first is to talk about the situation that you experienced. The second about the tasks that you had to perform, and these first 2 can go together if you want. Then the third one, talk about the actions that you took in that given situation and those given tasks. And finally, talk about the resolve of that situation. And actually framing your story around these 4 milestones, if you want, is what people call a star answer, or the star interviewing method. Now, again, some highlights here: keep everything in a narrative format, and it's very important that you first try to remember as much information as possible about those events, and I explain you later why. Again, you do this for 1 story, so ideally you should have at least 5 such stories. You should have as much content as possible. Why is it important to have as much content as possible? Well, because let's say I ask you a behavioral question right now. Tell me about a moment you dealt with a difficult coworker, right? So your main focus in such a scenario would be to know how to frame your answer, as opposed to think about the situation and spend extra brain cycles to think about the specific details about that given situation. So if you prepare that story in advance, you will have that reflex of getting the most important elements of that specific situation, and synthesize them into an answer that will hopefully connect very well with your recruiter, because after all, the goal is to connect well and to make a good impression to that recruiter. And In fact, there's a very interesting quote that I found on the internet from someone that actually got the job at Facebook. These interviewers are trained and calibrated to identify crappy people and have an acute attention to. It's a quick way to get your candidacy thrown out the window. Just be genuine, show passion for your work, own your flaws, show initiative for improvement, and you'll do fine. Now, the other step for preparing for this behavioral interview is to just simply look up the 20 most common behavioral questions. And in fact, here's a list from Facebook with fewer questions, but still very good ones. So the idea would be to take these questions and prepare answers for them. And ideally, you should prepare at least 2 to 3 answers for each of these questions. Why you should prepare multiple answers? Because your recruiter might be you might prefer giving different answers to different recruiters, not fake answers, but real answers, but different people connect in different ways, and this is why you want to prepare a different type of answer for a different type of recruiter. So again, you should take probably the 20 most common behavioral questions and just answer them. So here the best overall strategy to your behavioral interviewing quest here is to at least prepare those 5 stories and then answer the most common behavioral questions. And more likely than not, you will build up that reflex into properly answering these behavioral questions. And last but not least, also make sure that you also prepare some questions for Facebook. And a method that you want to keep in mind for brainstorming as to what's the best things that you should ask them is to use this 4 C's method, in which I basically give you these 4 areas that you might consider asking questions about. And finally, make sure that you have a positive attitude no matter what happens, because this is a well-known trap for too many introverts, and because engineers tend to be introverts more likely than not. And I'll just close with some interesting pieces of advice from Facebook's jobs website. Focus on your strengths. We like to ask, what were you doing on your very best day at work? We want you to do that not just on your best day, but every day. Show us something you've built. Builders look at the world with fresh eyes. They see things that are good but could be better and figure out how to make it so. We look for candidates who've got the same building mindset, whether they're applying for executive roles or internships. Share when you failed and learn. Don't hesitate to talk about the blunders you've made in the pursuit of big ideas. We want to hear about those as much as your wins. Now, I intentionally left out this from being a separate section in this video, simply because I don't believe that the best strategy to apply at Facebook is to have a keyword-rich resume. And in fact, an interesting piece of advice here is a quote from a recruiter. You should focus on telling a clear story about what you've done, and in a cover letter explain why you think you'd be a great fit for Facebook and what you want to contribute when you join. Now, this being said, you should invest a generous amount of time into writing a proper CV. And I say this because despite Facebook being primarily an engineering culture, recruiters there still do not appreciate typos. So make sure that you thoroughly check it before sending it. And by the way, you could also ask a friend to review it for you if this helps. Now, also, if you want a great example of what a one-page resume looks like, here's one. And finally, try a simple exercise. Try to read your CV in 6 seconds, because apparently this is how long it takes recruiters in general to review a CV and to form an impression about an applicant. So after reading your CV for 6 seconds, would you hire yourself? So all in all, Facebook is a very down-to-earth business when it comes to hiring, and of course they are only looking for very smart people, and even more interesting, smart people that perform on a consistent basis. And I believe that their recruitment marketing pitch, that of not focusing on essentially hiring for culture fit, but more on delivering on their mission, is something that does actually get many people excited about, and I believe it's also not by mistake that they are the #1 ranked company to work for on Glassdoor. Thank you for watching.